This is audio and explanation for the editorial called Starvation Under the Orange Trees by John Steinbeck. And John Steinbeck is probably most famous for his novels East of Eden and The Grapes of Wrath. He's one of my favorite writers. And he was writing a lot in the 1930s. And this essay in particular in his novel, The Grapes of Wrath, really brought attention to some of the horrible practices that were going on with farming. And a lot of farmers were kind of pushed out of their farms because of increases in technology and a lot of banks buying up bankrupt farms in the 1930s. Farmers were really impacted by the banks failing, the Great Depression, and then the Dust Bowls were happening. And then technology was increasing. And so work that used to be done by hand was then done by machines. So less people were needed. So jobs were lost that way. And basically people that had the most money to buy the technology ended up kind of winning out and buying up all these farms from people that didn't have money. Then all these poor people were pushed out and they moved to where they thought the farming jobs were out in California, because at the time there had been increases in refrigeration and stuff like that. And so California was increasingly raising all of the produce in the United States, and then it was being shipped in refrigerated cars across the country. And farms in California were really taking advantage of workers. So since all these people were coming out to get jobs, they essentially didn't pay people a living wage. And people were dependent on traveling around for work. And they didn't have any job protections, and they didn't have any unions, and they didn't get paid. And so John Steinbeck was pointing out that the people that were raising the food for America were literally starving to death. And he's not exaggerating in this article. And his article actually resulted in a lot of changes. And his book, The Grapes of Wrath, resulted in a lot of positive changes for farm workers. Farm workers still talk about some of the problems with how farm workers are paid, because we as Americans like to have really affordable, cheap food, right? But in order to have that cheap food, we also need to have cheap labor. And so the people that are raising our food don't always they're not able to afford the best food themselves. So these still remain problems, but not in the same way that they were in the 1930s, for sure. And I think this article is a really interesting contrast to the John Down letter that we just read, because this is going to be entirely different than John Down's perception of America. And this is 100 years later, right? Like, things have changed. There's John Steinbeck, our author, also guy with an awesome mustache. All right. And I'm going to stop and explain this because I think this is an amazing piece of writing. It's really short, but it's really powerful. And I love how he uses language in this really beautiful, persuasive way. And I also included pictures throughout from a photographer named Dorothea Lange. And she basically had government funding at the time to take pictures across the United States during the Great Depression. And she did. And she documented life across America for people that were living in poverty. And really, her work was so powerful in drawing attention to some of the ways that the U.S. Needed to change and needed to improve. And I think her pictures were really persuasive and used a lot of pathos. So you can even use these appeals in artwork as well, and not just in writing. All right, so we'll get ready to start here. The spring is rich and green in California this year. In the fields, the wild grass is 10 inches high, and in the orchards and vineyards, the grass is deep and nearly ready to be plowed under to enrich the soil. Already, the flowers are starting to bloom. Very shortly, one of the oil companies will be broadcasting the locations of the wildflower masses. It is a beautiful spring. And he starts this, actually, it's going to shift in tone really quickly to something sad, but he starts with this really inspirational, beautiful imagery. We have pathos here. We're kind of inspired and we feel happy and peaceful in listening to this. There is no war in California, no plague, no bombing of open towns and roads, no shelling of cities. It is a beautiful year. Okay, again, we're inspired, we feel peace with all of this, right? And then he gets to this sentence where the tone really shifts. and thousands of families are starving in California. Okay. And this is supposed to kind of hit us like a rock, like this beautiful state, this beautiful food, this beautiful greenery, and people are starving. In the county seats, the coroners are filling in malnutrition in the spaces left for causes of death. So they're starving to death. For some reason, a coroner shrinks from writing starvation when a thin child is dead in a tent. Again, huge amounts of pathos here where we're talking about children that are literally starving to death. For it's in the tents you see along the roads and in the shacks built from dump heap material that the hunger is, and it isn't malnutrition, it is starvation. And here we see tone being contrast here, right? Like it's not that they're not getting enough, it's literally that they're not getting anything. And he uses this to really build a strong tone, and he uses this word starvation to also point out that it's someone's fault that this needs to be prevented. And it really contrasts with this idea of having food everywhere. Malnutrition means you go without certain food essentials and take a long time to die. But starvation means no food at all. The green grass spreading right into the tent doorways and the orange trees are loaded. In the cotton fields, a few wisps of the old crop cling to the black stems. But the people who pick the cotton and cut the peaches and apricots, who crawl all day in the rows of lettuce and beans, are hungry. The men who harvested the crops of California, the women and girls who stood all day and half the night in the canneries, are starving. And again, this is using pathos like all over the place. The people picking our food are literally starving. They're spending their whole day surrounded by food, and then they go home and they starve to death. And it's supposed to make us feel guilty too, right? That we're enjoying this food that they're picking and yet they're starving. It was so 2 years ago in Napomo. It is so now. It will continue to be so until the rich produce of California can be grown and harvested on some other basis than that of stupidity and greed. Again, he's appealing to guilt here too, trying to make us feel bad. What is it to be done about it? The federal government is trying to feed and give direct relief, but it's difficult to do quickly, for there are forms to fill out, questions to ask, for fear someone isn't actually starving may get something. The state relief organizations are trying to send those who haven't been in the state for a year back to the states they came from. The Associated Farmers, which presumes to speak for the farms of California, and which is made up of such earth-stained toilers as chain banks, public utilities, railroad companies, and those huge corporations called land companies, this financial organization is on the face of crisis, is conducting Americanism meetings and bawling about Reds and foreign agitators. Okay. And he's saying that this is becoming a political issue too, right? Like people don't want to help these people because they don't want to give free handouts. They don't want people taking advantage of the situation. And so there's just becoming all these forms to fill out and nothing's actually getting done to help the people that need it. It has been invariably true in the past that when such a close-knit financial group as the Associated Farmers becomes excited about our ancient liberties and foreign agitators, someone is about to lose something. Okay, and he's criticizing the people that have power here, right? Like when the farmers and all the financial organizations and banks, when they have a say in what's going on, they're not actually going to help the common people, the workers. Okay, that's his criticism. A wage cut has invariably followed such a campaign of pure Americanism. And of course, any resentment of such a wage cut is set down as the work of foreign agitators. Anyways, that is the Associated Farmers' contribution to the hunger of the men and women who harvest their crops. Okay, and he's saying that company owners don't actually care about helping them. Instead, they're just cutting wages. The small farmers, who do not belong to the Associated Farmers and cannot make the use of the slop chest, are helpless to do anything about it. The little storekeepers at crossroads and in small towns have carried the accounts of the working people until they are near to bankruptcy. Okay, and here Steinbeck is pointing out, hey, there's a lot of small businesses and small farmers that are trying to help this situation, but they don't have the power that these big corporations do, and so they're becoming bankrupt by just trying to help the workers. And there are 1,000 families in Tulare County and 2,000 families in Kings, 1,500 families in Kern, and so on. The family averaged 3 persons, by the way. With the exception of a little pea picking, there isn't going to be any work for nearly 2 months. Okay, and here he's pointing out, like, when crops, right now my peas are harvested in the garden, but they're not going to be in a week. And so when you have these kind of farm workers, they're just moving around from farm to farm. They don't have like a year-long job. It's very temporary. There is sickness in the tents, pneumonia and measles, tuberculosis. Measles in a tent with no way to protect the eyes means a child with weakened eyes for life. And there are varied diseases attributable to hunger, rickets, and the beginning of pellagra. The nurses in the country. So he's using some logos here, some facts, but he's also appealing to our emotions, right? That this is really heartbreakingly sad. And this, even if they live, they might get diseases that impact them for their life. The nurses in the county, and there aren't 1/10 enough of them, are working their heads off, doing a magnificent job, and they can only begin to do the work. The corps include nurses assigned by the federal and state public health service, school nurses and county health nurses, and a few nurses furnished by the Council of Women for Home Missions, a national church organization. I've seen them, red-eyed, weary from far too many hours, and seeming to make no impression in the illness about them. Okay, and again, he's showing that there are people trying to help, but it's not enough. It's too big of a problem, and he's really appealing to our sympathy. And then he also includes a little bit of ethos here, too. I've seen them. And so he's building credibility that he's a witness to this, too. Okay, and so he's building some personal credibility here. It may be of interest to reiterate the reasons why these people are in the state and the reason they must go hungry. They're here because we need them. And again, he's appealing to our guilt in this situation, right? That we as a nation are responsible for this. Because the white American migrants were here, before the white American migrants were here, it was a custom in California to import great numbers of Mexicans, Filipinos, Japanese, to keep them segregated, to herd them about like animals, and if there were any complaints, to deport or to imprison the leaders. This system of labor was a dream of heaven to such employers as those who now fear foreign agitators so much. Okay, and he's saying that, like, back in the day, these same companies used to just use foreign labor, and then they would abuse them, but nobody cared because it was foreign labor. And I don't think Steinbeck really actually thinks this is okay. All right, he's pointing out that that's actually a negative system, but he's pointing out that, like, no one knew that this abuses were happening because if someone complained about it, they could just be sent back to their home country. Okay. But then the dust and the tractors began displacing the sharecroppers of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Arkansas. Families who had lived for many years on the little cropper lands were dispossessed because the land was in the hands of the banks and the finance companies, and because these owners found that one man with a tractor could do the work of 10 sharecropper families. Faced with the question of starvation or moving, these dispossessed families came west. To a certain extent, they were actuated by advertisements and handbills distributed by labor contractors from California. It is to the advantage of the corporate farmer to have too much labor, for then wages can be cut. And so basically what these big companies were doing is they were sending out flyers and advertisements to get as many people as possible to apply for the jobs. And then when too many people applied because they were all needy and all coming out, then they just cut wages because they were like, well, you're just lucky to have a job. Then people who are hungry will fight each other for a job rather than the employer for a living wage. And that's what happened. It really caused a lot of division among the workers and jealousy. It is possible to make money for food and gasoline for at least 9 months of the year if you are quick on the getaway, if your wife and children work in the fields. But then the dead 3 months strikes, and what can you do then? And here we're seeing a lot of pathos as well. And he's saying basically these farm workers might make a living wage for 9 months of the year when there's stuff to harvest, but there's 3 months of the year where there's nothing to harvest. And so even if they are making a living wage, then they have those 3 months that they're not actually able to save up for because they're just barely getting enough to make it by that 9 months. Okay. The migrant cannot save anything. It takes everything he can make to feed his family and buy gasoline to go to the next job. If you don't believe this, go out in the cotton fields next year, work all day and see if you have made 35 cents. A good picker makes more, of course, but you can't. The method of concentrating labor for one of the great crops is this. Handbills are distributed, advertisements are printed. You've seen them. Cotton pickers want a Bakersfield or Fresno or Imperial Valley. Then all the available migrants rush to the scene. They arrive with no money and little food. The reserve has been spent getting there. So people are also spending all the money they have just traveling to the next farm to get a job. If wages happen to drop a little, they must take them anyways. The moment the crop is picked, the locals begin to try to get rid of the people who have harvested their crops. They want to run them out, move them on. The county hospitals are closed to them. They are not eligible to relief. You must be eligible to eat. That particular locality is through with them until another crop comes in. It will be remembered that 2 years ago, some so-called agitators were tarred and feathered. The population of migrants left the locality just as the hops were ripe. Then the howling of the locals was terrible to hear. They even tried to get the army and the CCC ordered to pick their crops. And so, even though some of the workers have tried to strike and tried to protest these low wages, they end up getting punished. And even the army is called in to punish them. About the 15th of January, the dead time sets in. There is no work. First, the gasoline gives out. And without gasoline, a man cannot go to a job, even if he could get one. Then the food goes. And then in the rains, with insufficient food, the children develop colds because the ground in the tents is wet. And we start seeing a lot of pathos here and a lot of emotional appeals. I talked to a man last week who lost 2 children in 10 days with pneumonia. His face was hard and fierce, and he didn't talk much. And we see here some ethos as well. Like, I personally talked to this person, and so he's building credibility there, but he's also building a lot of pathos here. Like, I can't imagine, and this detail that, like, the dad didn't even want to talk about it. I talked to a girl with a baby and offered her a cigarette. She took 2 puffs and vomited in the street. She was ashamed. She shouldn't have tried to smoke, she said, for she hadn't eaten for 2 days. And again, he's talking as a witness, which is building his credibility. Like, I've seen this myself. I haven't just heard this. I heard a man whimpering that the baby was sucking, but nothing came out of the breast. And for women that nurse their children, if they don't get enough food, their body stops making milk for their baby. And they don't have money for formula at this time. So basically, babies are starving to death because women aren't able to produce milk for their babies because they're starving. And I can't imagine how horrific this would be as a mother to not have enough milk from your body to give to your child, and knowing that your child was slowly dying because you weren't able to do, your body wasn't able to do what it needed to do for your baby. I heard a man, and again, he's talking, he's giving very first person accounts to build his credibility. I heard a man explain very shyly that his little girl couldn't go to school because she was too weak to walk to school, and besides, the school lunches of the other children made her unhappy. I heard a man tell in a monotone how he couldn't get a doctor while his oldest boy died of pneumonia, but that a doctor came right away after it was dead. It is easier to get a doctor to look at a corpse, not so easy to get one for a live person. It's easy to get a body buried. A truck comes right away and takes it away. The state is much more interested in how you die than how you live. The man who was telling about it had just found that out. He didn't want to believe it. And here we have so many emotional appeals here. And I think this line where he says, the state is much more interested in how you die than in how you live, is such a powerful line in here to be persuasive that we don't want to actually be this kind of people. Next year, the hunger will come again, and the year after that, and so on, until we come out of this coma and realize that our agriculture for all its great produce is a failure. And again, he's appealing to our guilt here, right? That even though we are enjoying this great produce, we are actually failing our people. If you buy a farm horse and only feed him when you work him, the horse will die. No one complains of the necessity of feeding the horse when he is not working, but we complain about feeding the men and women who work our lands. Is it possible that this state is so stupid, so vicious, and so greedy that it cannot feed and clothe the men and women who help to make it the richest area in the world? Must the hunger become anger, and the anger fury, before anything will be done? And this use of questions here is very accusatory to us, like we need to do something. And his word choices just show the anger that he has for this. And his main argument here and his purpose of writing is that, one, we need to be more aware of how abusive our food system is. But we also need to make sure that those people are fed for the 3 months that they're not working. Because if we're going to use them as farm workers during those 9 months, we need to make sure that they can actually survive the rest of the year. And what Steinbeck wrote resulted in a lot of changes in our food system that were really positive changes for these workers. There are a lot of people arguing that there's still changes that need to be made today, but Steinbeck's essays and his writing to really make people aware of how abusive our food system was in the 1930s had a really powerful impact on what changes happened.